John Miller was known as the quiet man with a short fuse, but his daughter Emily was the one who carried the family light, until a single gunshot in their backyard turned a Saturday afternoon into the kind of nightmare no one in their town would ever forget. It was a Saturday that looked like any other, the kind of day when no one expects tragedy to strike. The sun had settled high in the sky, casting a golden glow over the neat rows of suburban houses. The air was calm, filled with the distant sounds of children pedaling bicycles along sidewalks and dogs barking at passers-by. Neighbors trimmed hedges, washed cars, and waved to one another in that ordinary, familiar way. Nothing about the day hinted at the horror that was about to unfold. The family living in the small white house at the corner of the block was not unusual. From the outside, they looked like everyone else. Quiet, private, and routine. Behind their wooden fence, however, tension and frustration often simmered unseen. The father, a man in his early 40s, had developed a habit that unsettled many of his neighbors. He complained constantly about the crows that gathered in the tall trees around his yard. Their squawking irritated him, and he believed they were destroying his vegetable garden. Some shrugged it off as eccentricity, but others were uneasy when they saw him step outside carrying a shotgun. They whispered about his short temper and the way he took aim at birds as if he were fighting an enemy. For him, firing at the sky was a way to take control of something he couldn't stand. For the neighborhood, it was a routine they tried to ignore, though unease lingered every time the sharp crack of a gunshot rang out. Inside the house, his teenage daughter was used to her father's moods. She had long since stopped arguing with him about his obsession. Her life revolved around school, friends, and plans for a future far beyond their small town. She dreamed of leaving for college, escaping the constant tension that seemed to hang in the air at home. On that day, she was in her room, scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing out the window at the bright yard beyond. She had no idea that she would soon step outside into a moment that would end her life. The father paced in the backyard with his shotgun in hand. His eyes scanned the branches overhead, following the shadows of birds as they darted from tree to tree. He muttered about how they were mocking him, about how they always returned no matter how many times he chased them off. He raised the weapon to his shoulder, focusing on the fluttering shapes above. To him, it was nothing more than another small battle in his ongoing war against the creatures that disturbed his peace. The neighborhood was still. A neighbor watering his plants heard the metallic click of the shotgun being readied. Another, pulling weeds near her fence, froze when she saw the man lift the barrel skyward. They were used to this sight, but there was something unsettling about the way he moved that afternoon, a jitteriness in his body, a determination in his eyes. The street remained quiet, unaware that within seconds a life would be lost. As the father steadied himself, the birds above cawed loudly, their wings cutting through the air. He inhaled deeply, gripping the gun tighter, preparing to fire. At that exact moment, his daughter pushed open the back door. She was calling for him, ready to remind him it was time to come inside. She stepped onto the grass, completely unaware that she was walking straight into danger. The echo of the first shot shattered the calm of the afternoon. A thunderous blast rolled across the neighborhood, startling birds into a frenzy of wings and scattering children who had been riding their bikes nearby. The father's ears rang as he lowered the gun slightly, watching feathers drift down through the air. He thought he had driven off the crows, that he had won another round in his private battle. But then came a sound that froze him where he stood, a sharp, piercing cry that did not belong to any bird. His daughter had crumpled onto the grass just a few steps away from him. She had been smiling only seconds before, calling to him with the casual ease of a teenager used to her father's routines. Now her voice was gone, replaced by a choking gasp as she clutched her neck. The father's hands trembled as he realized what had happened. A single pellet, part of the spray from his shotgun blast, had struck her at a fatal angle. The tiny piece of metal that was meant for the sky had torn into her flesh. Panic spread instantly through the yard. The father dropped the gun and rushed to her side, pressing his hands desperately against the wound. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his clothes as his daughter's body went limp beneath him. He shouted for help, his voice raw and frantic, echoing over fences and into neighboring yards. The very people who had always muttered about his reckless habits now stood frozen, staring at the scene in disbelief. Some rushed forward, others fumbled with their phones, dialing emergency numbers with shaking hands. Within minutes, sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with every second. Neighbors stood in clusters, their faces pale, as the father cradled his daughter and rocked back and forth on the grass. The sound of her breathing grew weaker, each gasp more shallow than the last. By the time paramedics pushed through the gate, there was little left to save. They lifted her gently, working with urgency, but the silence that followed told the story no one wanted to believe. For the father, the moment seemed unreal. Only minutes earlier, he had been focused on birds and branches, irritated by noise in the trees. Now the noise had been replaced by an unbearable quiet, one that would never leave him. His mind spun with disbelief, trying to piece together how an act so ordinary, so familiar, had spiraled into tragedy. He told anyone who would listen that it was an accident, that he hadn't seen her come outside. His words spilled out rapidly, his voice cracking under the weight of his guilt. Neighbors whispered among themselves, torn between shock and judgment. They had warned each other about his dangerous habits, yet no one thought it would end like this. Some believed it was a horrible mistake. Others were not so sure. To them, the man's obsession with firing at birds had always carried a darker edge, and now his daughter had paid the price. The police officers who arrived on the scene looked grim as they surveyed the blood-stained grass and the abandoned shotgun. What had begun as just another Saturday afternoon had transformed in the span of one gunshot into the darkest day the neighborhood had ever witnessed. The flashing red and blue lights cast a harsh glow across the quiet street as police cars lined the curb. Officers moved quickly, stringing yellow tape around the small white house while neighbors gathered in uneasy clusters. The father sat on the back steps, his hands trembling, his shirt soaked in blood that no amount of frantic wiping could erase. His eyes were distant, fixed on the spot where his daughter had fallen, as if he could not look away from the terrible truth that had unfolded. The shotgun lay on the ground nearby, untouched since he dropped it in panic. Investigators walked carefully across the yard, examining the weapon, noting its position, and marking the spots where pellets had struck the trees. They measured the angle of the shot, tracing the path of the deadly spray. What immediately drew their attention was that the gun had not been fired directly into the air, as the father claimed. Instead, the barrel had been angled downward toward the line of trees and bushes that bordered the fence. To trained eyes, this was not the controlled action of someone carefully aiming at the sky, but the reckless behavior of a man who fired without thinking about where his daughter might be. As the father stammered through his explanation, details began to emerge that painted a troubling picture. Witnesses told officers that he had been drinking earlier in the afternoon, sitting on the porch with a bottle in hand before stepping into the yard with his shotgun. Others admitted they had long feared something like this would happen, since he often fired into the air without warning, ignoring the safety of those nearby. One neighbor, her voice shaking, described how she had seen him wave the gun around carelessly in the past, always muttering about birds and pests, as though they were enemies in a war only he understood. Inside the house, detectives searched for clues to support or contradict the father's story. They found half-empty bottles on the kitchen counter and a chair knocked over near the back door, as if someone had hurried out in a rush. The girl's phone lay on the table, its screen still lit with a message she had been typing before she went outside. The image of her unfinished words was a haunting reminder of how abruptly her life had been cut short. Back outside, the scene grew more chaotic as news of the shooting spread. Reporters arrived, their cameras capturing the flashing lights and the heavy expressions of the officers. The father was eventually placed in the back of a police car, not under arrest but separated from the crowd while detectives pieced together the sequence of events. His face was pale, his hands clenched into fists, as he insisted over and over that it was all a mistake. Yet the evidence suggested more than a simple accident. The neighborhood that had once overlooked his behavior now found itself at the center of a tragedy that could not be explained away so easily. The careless gunfire, the drinking, the temper, all of it combined into a moment that ended a young girl's life. What police needed to determine was whether this was truly a tragic accident or the result of years of recklessness that had finally gone too far. The air was heavy with silence, broken only by the clicking of cameras and the low murmur of voices, as the investigation began to uncover secrets that would change how everyone saw the man they once called a neighbor. The investigation into the shooting stretched beyond the boundaries of that quiet yard. Detectives began digging into the father's past, determined to uncover the truth about what kind of man he really was. At first glance, he seemed like an ordinary working-class parent, someone who lived a simple life and kept to himself. But the deeper the search went, the more unsettling details came to light. Records revealed that police had been called to his home more than once over the years. Complaints ranged from loud arguments to reckless handling of firearms. None had ever resulted in serious charges, but they painted a picture of someone whose temper and poor judgment were no secret. Neighbors who had remained polite on the surface now admitted they had long worried about him. One recalled how he once fired a gun late at night, claiming he saw a shadow move across his yard. Another remembered heated confrontations with delivery workers, incidents that ended with the father brandishing a weapon in anger. Some even said they had considered reporting him again after recent weeks of more frequent gunfire, but no one believed the situation would escalate to tragedy. Their voices, once whispers, now filled police reports with a steady stream of warnings that no one had acted on in time. Family acquaintances added another layer to the growing portrait of instability. According to several of them, the father's relationship with his daughter had grown tense in the past year. She was an ambitious teenager with dreams of leaving town for college, determined to carve out a life far from the small house and the shadow of her father's controlling behavior. He, on the other hand, resisted the idea fiercely. Friends revealed that he often spoke about not wanting her to leave, claiming she was too young and that he needed her at home. Arguments between the two became more frequent, sometimes loud enough for neighbors to overhear. Detectives pieced these accounts together with the physical evidence from the day of the shooting. The angle of the gun, the alcohol on the counter, the history of reckless behavior. All of it pointed toward a man who had been spiraling for years. Though he claimed the shooting was an accident, many investigators began to wonder if deeper motives existed. Was the shot that killed his daughter truly an unintended stray pellet, or the result of a dangerous mix of anger, stubbornness, and recklessness that had reached its breaking point? The daughter's friends shared stories of her confiding in them about her father's temper. She had admitted she was afraid of him when he drank and that she often stayed out of the house as long as possible to avoid confrontation. She spoke of her college applications as her escape plan, her ticket to freedom. These private fears, combined with the father's history, fueled suspicion that the shooting was not merely a tragic accident. What began as the simple story of a man firing at birds now carried a darker weight. The evidence suggested years of tension, hostility, and warning signs that had gone unanswered. For the investigators, the question was no longer just how the daughter had died, but whether the father's long history of reckless violence had finally caught up to him in the most devastating way imaginable. The courtroom was packed with people eager to hear the outcome of a case that had gripped the community from the moment the story broke. Reporters filled the front rows, their cameras flashing as the father was led in wearing a suit that hung loosely on him, his face pale and drawn. He looked nothing like the man neighbors once described as loud and restless. Now he seemed hollow, weighed down by the knowledge that his actions had taken his daughter's life. The jury sat in silence, their expressions hard as the trial entered its final days. prosecutors built their case with methodical precision. They played recordings of frantic 911 calls, presented photographs of the blood-stained grass, and showed diagrams of the shotgun blast trajectory. Experts testified that the weapon had not been fired safely into the air, but angled low enough to put anyone nearby in danger. They described the recklessness of handling a firearm after drinking and emphasized the years of complaints that had been ignored. To them, this was not an unfortunate accident. It was the predictable outcome of a man who treated firearms carelessly and failed to control his temper. The defense painted a different picture. They spoke of a grieving father devastated by what had happened, a man who had lost the child he loved most in the world. They argued that the tragedy was the result of bad luck, a single miscalculation in a moment when no one could have predicted his daughter would step outside. They insisted that while his judgment was flawed, there was no malice, no intent to harm. Their plea was for compassion, urging the jury to see the incident as a heartbreaking accident rather than a crime. As the trial unfolded, witnesses took the stand to share stories that further complicated the narrative. Some neighbors described the father's reckless behavior, his drinking, and the constant gunfire that made them uneasy. Others, however, remembered his softer side, the way he helped fix fences, shoveled snow for elderly residents, and once proudly cheered for his daughter at a school event. The courtroom heard two very different versions of the same man, leaving the jury to decide which was closer to the truth. The turning point came when the prosecution revealed the daughter's college application essays found on her computer. In them, she wrote about her dreams of leaving home, about her struggles with her father's strict and unpredictable nature, and about her determination to create a better future for herself. Her words, full of hope and quiet desperation, silenced the courtroom. To many, they underscored the years of tension that investigators had uncovered, hinting at a relationship fractured long before the fatal shot. When the jury finally returned, the room was tense enough to feel suffocating. The verdict, guilty of involuntary manslaughter, sent a ripple through the crowd. The father lowered his head, his shoulders collapsing under the weight of the decision. He would face years in prison, but no sentence could equal the loss he had caused. For the community, the case closed with more than just a conviction. It left behind a chilling reminder of how recklessness, ignored warnings, and unchecked anger could unravel into tragedy. The street where children once rode bicycles now carried the memory of sirens, gunfire, and a silence that would never truly fade.